Hello everyone, today we talk about the rise of Charles IV of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, King of Germany, King of Italy, and of all the sum, at least the Holy Roman Imperial, but also the private base, and this specifically the one of the Luxembourgs in Bohemia. Curriculum titling actually could be easily the most cultured of European medieval rulers, a figure of enormous importance in 14th century European history, and the ruler who made, let's say, Bohemia great. Can say again because it had already been quite of a power back in, especially in the second half of the 13th century, and that, however, easily made. And I made a video titled exactly like that. Bohemia as the heart of 14th century Europe from a political, cultural point of view. Today we will not talk about the figure complexively, but we will have to do it in some other video, as well as others in a bit more in detail, like this one, discussing his foreign and domestic policies and the various international implications of his rule that in part we are observing in the moment of rise to the throne. You know that fundamentally the Luxembourgs had inherited the Bohemian throne after the extinction of in main line of the Przemysl dynasty, so this great Slavic royal house that had in fact ruled over Bohemia since essentially the beginning of its political consistency, right, back in the High Middle Ages, and that had in fact reached an enormous power, especially after the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. So also this moment of great interregnum where with Ottokar II, who was incidentally Charles of Bohemia's great-grandfather himself, because Charles' mother was the daughter of essentially the son of Ottokar, who had succeeded the father on the throne after his death in the Battle of Markfeld in 1278, after which the Habsburgs had essentially secured the Austrian lands, the Styrians, Carinthian, etc. And in a very complex scenario where previously, in fact, the Bohemians had managed to extend their power as the greatest one, in fact, in the empire, right? They had reached the Adriatic. They had, in fact, taken over all these the Austrian lands through matrimonial policies, war, etc. They had been in conflict, in fact, with Germany, with Hungary. And Ottokar was an enormous figure. Is the sovereign after which Königsberg has been named because of his participation in the Baltic Crusades. There are broader implications in the policy of the Western Slavic lands, as much as in fact the Habsburgs would get involved in from the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. At some point, the Habsburgs got, in fact, the same Bohemian crown as well as the Polish one, right? As formal and ephemeral as an experience as it was, we should never forget how important the balance of power, even after the collapse of the essentially the German national monarchy, or at least the attempt to make the Germany such a thing like France and England, actually rested on important powers, right? Even though they were essentially private in nature, this was evident since the 13th century, even since Frederick II. If you look at his German policy, actually they were actually very impressive powers. Like the Habsburgs, at some point could have risen since the early 14th century as a major power in Europe, right? And this thing failed for many reasons, but some of them were accidental, right? And just essentially from the mid 15th century, the Habsburgs will secure this eventually the imperial title, so much that some historians have termed any ruler that between the Hohenstaufen and that 15th century Habsburgic reality, but count kings or something like that, including Charles of Bohemia, because they were, stressing the fact of the principalization of Germany at this point, that is the rise of certain private houses that were containing the vestiges, essentially public authority of the empire, right? So in the various kingdoms here, Bohemia is as you know, part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's not part of the Kingdom of Germany, so it was also something more complex in a way, but it was still very framed within this reality. I mean, Bohemia is much closer to Brandenburg than Austria is as a German land, and this also from a political and strategical point of view was, and dynastic one also, because at some point it was the incorporation, the dynastic inheritance of all these various lands. And this is a bit truer in Central Europe altogether. We've seen it in Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, that had this quite dynamic history, mostly due to instability, but still also with an important political institutional development. And so this picture is relevant because, in fact, not even the rise of Charles had to be given for granted. He was son of John of Bohemia. He was son of, in fact, Henry VII of Luxembourg, and these had been the first, essentially, Luxembourg dynasty, right, to reach that kind of importance of level. And their rise had been triggered politically, essentially, by the the contention of the other major German power that existed at the point. Initially the Habsburgs, and in this case, as we'll see, the Wittelsbachs that were at this point also kind of descending from the same part. Ludwig Ludwig IV of Bavaria was also kind of cousin of Frederick of Austria, and he defeated and captured in battle. And so we're a bit, this is the chaotic, apparently, picture that we get, but it was still based on very concrete power assessments that naturally in the politically fragmented Germany could really move in very different directions very quickly, right? So even the reign of Charles of Bohemia should not be given exactly for granted. Charles here had already had an experience, also a military international one. He had followed his father in Italy. That John of Bohemia was more of a knight errant than a king in practice. As we'll see now, he would die at the Battle of Crécy, where also Charles got wounded. They were siding with the French, essentially, in an anti-English and German in that moment because of the Wittelsbach faction, and in a pro-papal sense, by the way, because they were backed by them against the Ghibellines, let's say, both in Germany and in Italy. So that's the kind of references we should bear in mind. And so it's surely a very difficult situation, but let's say this is a moment where these principalities are looking for securing an important private asset, such as Bohemia could be, and the Luxembourgs were called there essentially because of this trend that we've seen that will bring also the Anjou in Hungary and in Poland. That is literally this shift towards the east of certain pretty Western powers. I mean, the Luxembourgs were technically French, right? Not even German, as the empire encompassed, in the westernmost areas, of course, French-speaking areas. And in such fragmented and stable and fluid realities, what you need to do, exploiting these pre-existing institutional systems, such as the empire, the monarchies that are contained with it, is essentially floating over the various communities of the empire by essentially intervening in their local affairs, so getting power from one faction that is getting more power, is more in charge there, is more established, and you can eventually profit from it, or still making something different in the regard, but often backed by the same thing. This is, for example, all about the Italian policy of the Luxembourgs. The Henry VII, so Charles' grandfather, had essentially the first German monarch to have relaunched in, say, Germanic, better in the sense of the empire, rather, the Raumfahrt, the Italian expeditions after generations. And it was actually an important thing. So sometimes when we read that, we see, but the empire was already declining, it would have not changed much. Actually, if you study in detail what happened, it's not really quite the case. Even if the thing failed, and that was a hell of an expedition also from a military point of view. Yes, it was mostly paid, also supported by other powers. The Italians were doing it, the Ghibellines at least. There was all support from other powers that were looking against the Angevin papal axis and so on. but eventually with Ludwig of Bavaria, we have something smaller, more pragmatic, like Henry VII wanted to resume the universalistic project, the Mediterranean policy in grand style, in spite of the limitations from, let's say, the previous century. But Ludwig of Bavaria was much more pragmatic. He got in Italy, he got the money from here and there, got in Rome, got the imperial title, went back to Germany, all right? And with the expedition of John of Bohemia, after which, his son Charles went, it's more like we are in fairy tales. Like, it's literally like a knight errant enters in Italy with 200 knights, and basically the world power is supported by the other various cities that are, locally paying for this guy to bring a certain order, at least in the balance there, to send them against other rival powers and so on. He manages even to create this seigneury over certain cities that are, trying to escape essentially the expansionism of the major seigneuries locally, and that eventually passes because there is really no consistency to it. It's at that point there is even a dichotomy because these Germanic rulers were seen mostly in a Ghibelline sense, but what happens with John of Bohemia at that point in an anti-Wittelsbach fashion is that, albeit not particularly in tune with the papacy initially, they get allied and they practice. Charles commands the Modenese army at the Battle of San Felice. He scores an important victory. He got a military experience there against the Esten and their supporters. And also his father was very much involved. He fought pretty much everywhere in Eastern Europe, in France. There was a large scale at that point of European, properly international intertwinement that you can argue many aspects, including also during the reign of Charles of Bohemia, of modern Europe in a sense, also with the shrinking of universal powers paradoxically, but also the rise of these other let's say national powers, the emergence at least of a definition of certain aspects of our current modern culture by a certain degree. So the picture was a mess, also because this is the moment of great crisis and contraction of the European system. Charles becomes King of Bohemia in 1346, so we are basically 2 years before the Black Death, and still already a moment of great contraction from an economical point of view, with loss of this was heading naturally towards a privatization of power, a bit like today, and the definition of different centers of power that Charles with Prague, but also with properly the concept also of a capital, a real seigneurial, a territorial power, well defined. In the case of Bohemia, it was well placed in this sense, right? Would be reinforced, right? What happened with this Central European monarchies like Poland and Bohemia and Hungary? The reason why they would call a foreign dynasty to rule was naturally an opportunity for the dynasties that were rising, like in this case, to a royal title, like the Luxembourgs. In the case, the extension of a broader, system, like almost of imperial fashion, like in the Angevin case with Hungary and Poland and Naples, etc. But the deal specifically with those Central European powers is that it was actually the local aristocracy that wanted to make the sovereign rule depend essentially on their support. So if this was an outsider, it was easier to send back, right, or to cut, let's say, the connections, right? In terms of actual power, and Charles embodies that, but this is not completely true, right? But it was always a negotiation with essentially a mechanism, an electoral mechanism, right? This is true also for Germany, if you think about that. This was so evident, that it was so chronicle at that point already, that we don't even take. This doesn't mean that you can't create something more compact and consistent, but on the longer run, you realize, and we made videos on this, that eventually the institutional solidification of these monarchies didn't actually take off because of always of this pressure from the native aristocracy say, no, we want to be in charge of. And there are, especially in Bohemian history, many nuisances regarding to this. Think about the Hussite Wars later on, and I don't even remember the point I was making now, but it's at least this aspect of the elective monarchies in the foreign dynasty is important to remember. And towards the end of the reign of Ludwig IV of Bavaria, it seemed likely that the transfer of power from the Wittelsbach to the Luxembourgs would have been a very violent one, right? Because a good part of Germany was essentially not to support the rise of the Luxembourgs without taking arms, at least. So this could have escalated into a mass, warfare, destruction, and so on. And the idea was also that the Wittelsbachs were presenting there with a deterrent force enough for preventing maybe even the same rise of the Luxembourgs, right? So it was not an easy situation initially for Charles, because as son of the Bohemian King John, at this point a grandson of Henry VII, he was elected King of the Romans as the direct instigation of the papacy, right? That at that point was dramatically opposed to Ludwig of Bavaria, because essentially in Italy they had been tremendous enemies. That there is probably a level of ideological embitterment, let's say, between this universal powers like papacy and empire. In this moment are shrinking, both dramatically, but they are embittering, for this sense, the ideological struggle in refining properly also the propagandistic political tools. Right, we are at the time of the Avignonese papacy. We are at this point, as before, say, but there was a pro-French policy, obviously in that context. So we are at the time of Marsilius from Padua, at the service of Ludwig of Bavaria, who wrote the most radical ideas that had been expressed on the nature of papal power of the time, basically denying any kind of legitimacy of any kind of secular power for the papacy, so buying fully the imperial ideological agendas, something, the church had been bitterly criticized, but to that extreme nobody had ever quite arrived. This wouldn't actually create it had an important cultural and political impact, because this is also the moment from which the Germanic, let's say, the Holy Roman Empire acquires a more markedly Germanic, if not German, character, because it literally shrank to that kind of German, also in this case Bohemian. Think about the gradual definition of the major electors, but let's say something that is even in the official titling of the empire starts to be something called like of the Germanic nation, which would gradually unhinge this, the confirmation of Germanic sovereigns through papal support, right? And but if anything, because internationally speaking, the situation was so fragmented and deteriorated that there was never quite a unity anymore. Like before, I don't know, at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, there were opposers in the empire, both in Germany and Italy, etc. But that was the king, and he was waging war and making this universal policy. As at that point, he embodied factually the German power, right, the Germanic Empire. And so it was. At this point, you couldn't even exactly tell, right? It doesn't matter that somebody was elected emperor. Still, it was another powerful house that ruled next to them in a way that they couldn't really do much about that, because they were still based on a private title, rather on a private power rather than on a formal title, right? So it was very easy to lament such legitimacy institution. And this for the empire, even for the papacy, in a sense, they had abandoned Rome. They had somewhat also at this point being dramatically invested into political military activity. There was nobody bought, let's say, the spiritual dimension that the papacy, after all, during the 12th to 13th century had embodied in a sense, not because they behaved differently, but because even in there was a universalistic reach that at this point was falling. At the end of the century would be the council, there would be the great schism of the West. So even that in parallel, internationally mirrors this kind of situation for the papacy. I made a video, by the way, on the decline of universalism, which is titled like that, so, and it deals exactly with this times and the broader atmosphere, of the broader temper of the time. And the fact that, in fact, the Luxembourgs at this point would be backed by the papacy in the empire was kind of an obvious way for saying, you're just a papal puppet, right? So you are here from not just as an properly as an anti-Germanic power, at least as an outsider in a way or another. The Germans, in this sense, didn't have. It was not much about a national thing, but these were, in fact, French rulers grafted on a Slavic power that, in a sense, for many of the Germanic area, had no business to interfere, especially while they were implacably, they were supported by the implacably hostile papacy towards the current rule, the current emperor, against the Wittelsbach, that had managed to catalyze most of the German support from their side. So the Luxembourgs naturally had negotiated much this their rise at Avignon, where the papal curia was located, and of course this had a cost. So they weren't doing it because they were intrinsically different from any of those Germanic rulers. Just that they, at that point, everybody knew that they were getting where they were getting the money from, the support from, any exchange of what. Of course, there was greater interference, a papal interference in the imperial affairs, which was factually the promise there that had to be fulfilled, what we would give in exchange, right? So especially the election of Charles as king of the Romans, so essentially the would-be emperor, right, on an institutional level in Germanic policy, was an attempt also to mediate between the already happened rise in power of the Luxembourgs and the hostility of the Wittelsbachs, because if Charles at that point had been backed by such a universal power like the papacy, yes, it would have triggered so much discontent, but at the same time, it would have still provided the ruler with some kind of further legitimization. And there were, naturally, at this point, the Luxembourgs were to promise a lot to the papacy, right, of politically, militarily, because, yes, they had to access, they had to provide the papacy access to certain imperial, to interfere in certain imperial policies. They would have had to provide military support to the Pope, also in the Italian theater and so on. So this translated in practice in concessions to France, right? The Avignonese papacy was not really a French pawn, as it's been pointed out. They were simply allies, right? Even in the fact that these were mostly all French popes, actually has nothing to do with the national policy. Like the church was operating on its own account, right? And yes, and at this point were allies to France from quite a while historically, so there was no doubt about the fact that they had many interests in common, but still they were carrying out two autonomous policies, right? It's important to stress, right? So France naturally had at this point was the major power, however struggling as the 100 Years' War had began. So the defeats also now 1346 is not a random year, by the way, also on that front, as we will see now. So the various representatives politically in the empire, etc., began to denounce Charles, as it was called, as essentially a papal stooge, right, the Pfaffenkaiser in German. So also there was an effort of dynasticization of such international titles, right? This was not possible to be done with the Roman one, because kings of the Romans were only elected rulers, so they could be backed by different powers, but still there was no way in the Germanic institutional mechanism to turn it into a in fact hereditary prerogative. Eventually, even when it would happen with the Habsburgs, it would happen in a much more obvious situations when objectively, yes, at that point that house was much more powerful in Germany, had secured an important degree of support, and also this fluidity in the empire didn't exist anymore, or at least the bigger game, the game was bigger at an international level, and there was less approximation on a local level like now. It was kind of the peak of fragmentation in a sense, or maybe not even, but still the one where the odds between the various princely powers were more balanced in a sense. And so there was an effort at the time, like it would happen in pre-modern times during the Renaissance, to cumulate this prerogative, so to add various elements of legitimacy in order to become to become a de facto recognized and powerful ruler, right? And another problem is of territorial nature, right? A part of the reason why it was so difficult to maintain a balance politically is that, albeit a powerful dynasty like the Luxembourgs now had, Bohemia, still this was not just a unitary thing. There were different, at least institutionally, on paper it was, but just there were different houses within the same kingdom. This had been a problem for the same premislids back in the day. We had always attempted to centralize at the expense of the nobility, and in fact, a kingdom like Bohemia in a sense was more functional than others. Like Germany in itself was a much more heavily and intertwiningly feudalized land, like literally a fix where it was impossible, because Germany at this point was an important, like it had reached essentially Italy in size of population. It was, yes, it wasn't such a florid economic situation there like in most of Europe at that point, but it was a big system. So to actually even pretend to dislodge certain dynasties that were entrenched in their feudal prerogative, it doesn't matter how many other competitors there were for this thing to be so unstable, but it was exactly where the same German kings back in the day had decided not to invest in. Right, it was better to secure a land like Italy and to rule from there than trying to conquer a land like Germany, especially in the periphery that were, was not the cost-benefit ratio was not really, making you do that. So that's the reason, in fact, also why the Luxembourgs continued with the Italian policy. But let's say that this Western Slavic lands, or also Hungary, etc., provided with, let's say, in some ways a less powerful, or at least an insufficiently powerful land to take over the whole system at that point, because without the German control it was factually impossible, and there the monarchy had collapsed. So it literally all the public rights here, that is, the various lands that had once belonged to the state that couldn't be retaken anymore, if not to fighting those dynasties, in fact. But at least they provided with a more concentrated power. Was up to that point not as challenged feudally from the below, like a country like Germany, which is a big statement, because of course also Bohemia, and especially Bohemia among the Western Slavic lands, was the most heavily feudalized, Germanized. So it doesn't even make too much sense to try to distinguish the things, but it's slightly different. Like the aristocracy was slightly less powerful, and it was framed from in a more unitary system traditionally than, let's say, Germany was, right, for the sake of command. So that's also what provided the Luxembourgs with that base to make the same Bohemia flourish. And there had been an important urban policy, for example, since the time, from a long time, where that was an interesting way to counter the oligarchy, the nobiliar power, rurally based, and so on. All the things we will see on another occasion. I partly talked about this on that video about the Bohemian Diet during the Hussite Wars, so I addressed a bit later how the situation figured, but it can be interesting. And so the election of Charles IV, who until then had always been Margrave of Moravia, right, and heir to the Bohemian throne because his father was still alive, right, took place on July the 11th, 1346, at Rennes, and was carried by 4 genuine votes and one of doubtful validity, right? That essentially was the one of the king of Bohemia, in fact, his father. The archbishops of Cologne and Trier, that were a big deal, especially the first. The Duke of Saxony, right, and this made the 4 legal votes, and it was already a very powerful support. Whilst the Archbishop of Mainz, so the third of the great electors, ecclesiastical electors, to whom was reserved the right to summon the Council of Electors, by the way, because it was at the hand of essentially the strictly German affair, whereas Cologne figured for the Italian ones, Trier for the French ones. Well, this was reserved to, say, also voted for Charles, right? So this was contested, but his position had originally been held by Heinrich von Schwarzbach, that was a staunch Wittelsbach supporter, and Clement VI had stripped him of his office, appointing Gerlach of Nassau in his place. So Heinrich refused to accept this, and so there was even the shadow of a schism falling over the archbishopric of Mainz, which again was a big deal because, as essentially a representative of the strictly German ecclesiastical affairs, that papal intervention was higher in the tension relatively properly. The papal support of the Luxembourgs in a Wittelsbach, and by that point most of the German majority by that time. However, the Luxembourgs managed to score their fundamental objectives, right? Even though, of course, there was no way at that point to predict whether they would have succeeded or not, but it's at least setting on that track, right? The same coronation of Charles was a big deal, albeit this hadn't occurred how it would have been traditionally the case with Aachen, right? And most imperial cities remained loyal to Ludwig of Wittelsbach, right? So Charles had been elected in Bonn, where the Archbishop of Cologne resided, and that was, as we've seen, his supporter too. So as soon as Charles was elected, it was evident that the situation could not be solved but through war, right? The Wittelsbach were not to recognize Charles, and so both sides began to prepare for war, taking stock, etc. And there was for this matter, sort of calm before the storm, where Charles essentially tried to consolidate his foreign and domestic position. In August 1346, for example, he accompanied his, at that point, blind father in the French army at the Battle of Crécy, right? And as we know, John died, while Charles was only slightly wounded in the French catastrophe. Again, that was a prize for supporting the French papal side. However, John's death, in a certain sense, consolidated further Charles' position, as now he ascended to the Bohemian throne altogether. So he was increasing internationally as an individual his own weight. And importantly enough, another big event on October the 11th, 1347, was the death of the Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria, right? He essentially got a he died of a stroke in Munich after a hunting accident. He fell from a horse. Like, it's kind of a almost typical way of die for a medieval ruler. The Ludwig had carried out a very effective policy in his lifetime. He was a very shrewd, capable monarch for his power, his power availability, and naturally his death made things a big deal easier for Charles at that point. And it's almost incredible how many other opponents of the Luxembourgs died for Charles to take advantage in a short time, right? So much that nobody was factually capable of striking a blow to the Luxembourgs at that point to take advantage over them. It was Charles actually that took the initiative. He struck a blow at the Wittelsbachs in Brandenburg by acknowledging the claims of the so-called false Waldemar, that was essentially a mentally disturbed usurper that had pretended to be the last Margrave of Brandenburg of the Ascanian family, was traditionally Brandenburg, who had died in 1319. And so this was done essentially to embarrass the heirs of Ludwig for a series of reasons. And the opposing side, of course, was acting as well against Charles, but their attempts failed because either they were uncoordinated, and or there was effectively no agreement where to concentrate power. At some point, the minority of the pro-Wittelsbach electors chose this, essentially powerless Thuringian count, Gunter von Schwarzbach, that we made incidentally a video because of his effigy in the Dome of Frankfurt. But this one, a beautiful example, magnificent example of German armor of the time, who was elected anti-king of Germany, right, to Charles, because the king of the Romans was essentially the recognition of that factual control also on German affairs by that point. And this Gunther was elected on January the 30th, 1349, right? But his demise would have also been quite quick for a number of reasons that, however, proved essentially how weak his position was, right? Internationally speaking, by that point, Charles had already convinced Edward III of England to decline the honors offered to him by the Wittelsbach princes, because at that point, this is the thing is that Charles, as long as he was scoring success, was essentially operating autonomously in the empire, so not really needing support too much the papacy in France anymore. At this point, the English had scored this major victory on the French. So, I mean, even just Charles as king of Bohemia, but had no interest to oppose even territorially, like that point English policy in France. So they didn't care. Their enemies at this point were. His enemies at this point were crumbling and didn't quite need much of papacy support in the process anymore. So Edward actually agreed to decline the honors offered to him by the Wittelsbach princes, which is one important success. And the Wittelsbach coalition began thus to crumble, also because after the death of Charles' first wife, he married Anne, the daughter of Rudolf of the Palatinate, that was a member of the Wittelsbach party, right? So eventually Charles deployed his military might against Gunther von Schwarzbach at the Siege of Altville. That was a success. And proved how, the force that Charles could wage also properly as a militarily speaking. And Gunther surrendered his royal prerogatives at that point after having been offered a number of inducements. And Charles made peace also furthermore with the sons of Ludwig of Bavaria in exchange for the recognition of their territorial rights, because there was no way at that point to wage war on Bavaria to dislodge them from there. And this included actually even the rights that the Wittelsbach had on Tyrol and Brandenburg. So even on a larger German scale. So that at that point, it was not a form of weakness, but simply a recognition that its power was enough. It was not searching for creating more trouble, and this would make things situation more peaceful. And this political achievement brought Charles IV on the fore as the undisputed ruler of the empire, right? Even most imperial cities that had initially opposed him recognized him, right? And basically the majority, but by everybody, right? It was a general consolidation of central power that brought finally to his coronation in Aachen, right? So by tradition, let's say, that point on July 1349, which proved there was nobody to oppose him, because normally, as it had happened before, right, these cities could be garrisoned. There was no way to enter them to carry out the ceremony, and either you dislodge them with a military operation, but it would have been also a matter of, let's say, it was preferable not to do it. Also ideologically, symbolically, for the sacredness of the places, the symbol, and the general idea that whoever ruled had to do it with consent, right? And also they would have significantly weakened themselves with useless operations. And there were other problems now that were arising, because when you rise too much in power, and there is an aftershock somewhere else anyway, and as we were just saying, this most of the international situation and the relations with the papacy, right? Because Charles' independent behavior at this point had brought him to, if not to disconfess, but at least to provide the same, the same prerogatives that he had promised to the papacy initially, or that had led possible. So this was just becoming yet another powerful Germanic ruler who would have acted for himself, right? And therefore also, if circumstances had happened against papal interests. Plus, the general situation at that point was not good for most of Eurasia and beyond, because of the Black Death, right? The same Gunter von Schwarzbach, as we've seen last time, probably died of plague himself in the same 1349. In Germany, the plague was very severe, and it also led to very serious anti-Jewish pogroms. The Jews were completely innocent of anything, and this was also not really a proof of control from the emperor that should have prevented such episodes. That mostly anti-Jewish pogroms were always a matter of public control, right, and arrest. And normally the church had always protected the Jewry from the blind ferocity of the people and so the imperial cities themselves said, this is happening because the emperor fundamentally can make things going otherwise, right? So there was in terms of political thermometer, this massive epidemics that has never been seen, and in that by that scale, at that point, was perceived, and it was still in the medieval mentality as that there is something wrong happening, and surely was destabilizing further certain situations. And so this can be, let's say, the beginning of Charles IV rule, and we will talk about his policy further in various fields, domestically, internationally, his juridical policies, his economical policies, and so on, because they're very interesting, very complex, and made of this ruler one of the most important of the Middle Ages for sure. And we'll talk about him again hopefully soon. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.